Tuscany, mid-14th century. A mounting cycle of violence spurred on by the ambitions of the city elites and the absence of any universally respected authority set the stage for a new large-scale war between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Alliances and peace treaties, however grandly declared, were soon shattered, dragging the city-states into relentless strife, foretelling another torrent of devastation and bloody vengeance. I'm Jacopo Casagrande, your host, and in this episode we'll see how Florence and Siena prepared for war, the composition of their armies, and we'll follow the downward spiral of violence and greed that would bring Florence and Siena on the cursed battlefield of Montaperti, where beautiful, fertile land fields of Tuscany would be drenched in the blood of thousands of its sons. Siena and Florence were maneuvering their pieces across the vast Tuscan chessboard, both convinced that securing dominance over those lands required the other's destruction. Their brutal contest was nearing its final moves, with the fortresses of Montalcino and Montepulciano caught in the middle. Both strongholds were looking to Florence for support, wary of Siena's growing interference. In Siena's eyes, however, such behavior smacked of rebellion, almost a personal slight. Florence's political response took the form of sending a supply convoy escorted by tens of thousands of soldiers to the banks of the Arbia River, a clear message that Siena's expansion to the south would not go unchecked. Behind the scenes, the figure of Manfred, son of the late Emperor Frederick II of Swabia, was emerging, resolved to resist the papacy's ambitions in his homeland, the Kingdom of Sicily in southern Italy. In 1258, when false news spread that his 4-year-old nephew Conradin of Swabia, the imperial heir, had died, Manfred seized the opportunity to have himself crowned in Palermo. This audacious move by the new king of Sicily swiftly provoked Pope Alexander IV furious backlash, accusing him of usurping the throne of St. Peter's rights over those lands. Even so, the Swabians sought diplomatic solutions, keeping good relations with Guelph cities such as Genoa and Venice, and even tried to secure an accord with Florence, long in league with the papacy. Manfred's objective was clear: to cast himself as arbiter or a balancing force among the many Italian cities and factions, well aware of how volatile they were and poised for war. In 1258, he dispatched an embassy to Florence in hopes of isolating Pisa, forcing it into his network of alliances. But the negotiations fell through, and by then anticipating conflict, Manfred of Sicily sent a first contingent of knights to Siena, small but symbolic, followed by larger units under his uncle Giordano d'Agliano. Siena swore loyalty in Frederick II's name, though Manfred insisted on a clause specifying that the pact is not directed against the Church, as he was reluctant to break with the Pope entirely. For its part, Siena worried that the king, in his quest for a broad peace, might sacrifice Sienese interests to benefit Florence or Lucca. In this complicated chess match, Pisa ended up almost on the sidelines. Despite being a city of proven Ghibelline faith, it was excluded from Manfred and Siena's designs. Florence, meanwhile, did not abandon his Guelph leanings, excommunication notwithstanding. The city remained determined to contain Swabian influence in Tuscany, confident it would still rely on a certain goodwill from Alexander IV, though relations with the pontiff were far from calm. By late 1259, the scene appeared almost frozen. Siena felt, in its own way, supported by Manfred. Florence prepared to mobilize against its rival. Pisa stood outside the major alliance framework, and Orvieto and Perugia were torn by internal Guelphs or Ghibelline faction, each seeking some advantage. Siena tried a shrewd diplomatic approach, negotiating with Ghibelline's faction in Perugia and Orvieto, while Manfred's troops advanced on Grosseto and Montemassi. In that tangle of interests and self-preservation, Manfred's true aim seemed to be gathering the Aldobrandeschi Cantes under his sway, the lords of the mountainous regions, the lords of the mountains, you might call them, making Siena a junior ally. In Siena, meanwhile, the idea of a decisive showdown with Florence was spreading. An embassy to Manfred was planned to request more troops, yet the city also sent a friar to Alexander IV as a last-ditch attempt at mediation. It proved futile, as Florence was already blocking Sienese property in its territory and urging its own citizens to put aside internal feuds, with war looming even closer. A mood of growing confidence took hold in Siena as conflict approached, vividly illustrated in a letter from 1260 written by a group of friends to a Sienese merchant living in France. When we write this letter, our friends Mino Pieri and Orlando Bonsignore are not in Siena, but with the forces heading towards Montepulciano. Know, Giacomo, that these days we are busy and spending heavily because of the war against Florence. And know that it will cost us dearly. But we shall deal with Florence so thoroughly that we won't regret it. We have already pillaged Colle and lands near Montalcino. Count Giordano d'Agliano has set out with all the German and the Sienese knights and the town militia to sack Montepulciano, and to do so without ceasing. We cannot say what will happen next. But know this, 800 knights are stationed here in Siena to destroy and annihilate Florence. And know that they are all so afraid of us and our knights that they are wetting themselves. The German knights pursued them from hill to hill like criminals. They burned and pillaged as close as 4 miles from Florence. Now you can see why they fear us. And know that we shall do them great harm this year, if God wills. Monday, July 5th, 1260. In the spring of 1260, tension indeed between Florence and Siena reached a boiling point, driving Tuscany towards a conflict that will reach one of its most dramatic peaks in the Battle of Montaperti. Little did anyone suspect that just 2 months later, the outcome of the struggle would be decided on a plain not far from their city. As we have seen, Siena was preparing for a broader confrontation, and Florence was no less resolute. Spurred on by increasing Sienese raid in the Maremma and Valdorcia regions, the city of the Red Lily began mobilizing its own forces and allies. Decades later, Giovanni Villani recounted that Florence's stated aim was to bring aid to Montalcino, a pro-Florentine stronghold rumored to be on the verge of siege. Yet given the scale of the mobilization, it appears they were gearing up for something far more extensive than a mere support mission. According to the chronicles, the first engagement took place on the 18th of May, 1260, just outside Siena's main northern gate, Porta Camollia, still visible today, though a short distance away near Santa Petronilla. Unfortunately, once more we find conflicting accounts in the sources. Here is the Florentine version, as told by Giovanni Villani. During that siege, the Ghibelline exiles from Florence hosted a feast for the German knights sent by King Manfred of Sicily. Once they saw these knights inebriated with wine, they urged them to arm themselves and mount their horses to attack the Florentine army, promising lavish gifts and double pay. Germans, frenzied and drunk, rode out from Siena and recklessly charged the Florentine camp, inflicting great losses despite being few in number, as there were only a handful of guards. But once they overcame the initial shock, the Florentines armed themselves and organized their defense, and not a single enemy who rode out from Siena returned alive. All were unhorsed and killed, and Manfred's Sicilian standard was captured and dragged through the mud. On the other hand, the Sienese version turned the story on its head. The German knights launched a furious attack on the Florentine camp, who fled, suffering over 200 dead and 500 wounded. In the end, the Florentines and their army returned to Florence for fear that more enemies might come out of Siena. The discrepancy between these accounts indicates that the clash on the 18th of May was no mere skirmish, but a serious wake-up call. Indeed, over the following days, the Sienese Comune took care to treat the wounded German knights at the public's expense and to summon further reinforcements from Manfredi. Florence, in turn, decided to raise an even larger army, determined not to be caught off guard. A most precious record of this preparation has survived to the present day. The Libro di Montaperti, the Book of Montaperti, among the most closely guarded treasures in the state archives of Florence and personally seen only by a handful of scholars. Within its pages we find a list of names, fines, authorizations for buying and selling horses, and an exhaustive set of rules on how and when one was expected to answer the call to arms. Every knight, infantryman, doctor, and notary knew exactly what their duties were, the minimum gear they were required to bring, and the penalties they would incur if they avoided serving. Let us look at the details together. First of all, while the city summoned a general mobilization, it never fielded its entire force at once. On each occasion, the captain of war chose 3 or 5 sesti, districts of Florence, in rotation to send into the field, while the others remained behind to defend the city. Each sesto divided its men under vexilla, further splitting them into bands of 25, called venticinquine, drawn from the various parishes. Notarial registers detail the equipment required. Infantrymen wore a steel cervelliera, a light metal skullcap, a gorget to protect the neck, and either leather or padded fabric breastplates. They also had iron sleeves for their arms, a spear, and a wooden shield covered in leather. All costs fell to the individual citizen, and lacking even a single item could result in a steep fine, ranging from 10 soldi for one missing piece to 20 soldi if someone turned up without armor. Considering that a foot soldier's daily pay was 30 denari, about 2 soldi, a fine might be the equivalent of around 2,000 modern-day dollars. Cavalry, the noble core of the army, was organized into 6 or 7 squads of 25 knights each, set out in 5 poste of 5 men apiece. Every knight was required to own a warhorse valued at no less than 45 lire, complete with the saddle, covering, helm, iron halberd, armored legs, lance, and shield. Given the high cost of horses, some hopeful warriors shared the same amount in joint ownership. There were, in fact, cases of individuals stating non habet nisi medietate munius equi, he only holds half of a horse, forcing them to give up their place as cavalrymen and pass it on to a substitute. Nonetheless, the army did not consist solely of infantry and knights. There were also the so-called equitatores, mounted fighters who were not necessarily noble, grouped into cinquantine or 50s, as well as the berrovieri, professional soldiers on fixed-term contracts, often from other cities, something akin to modern-day contractors. These experts also profited from the prisoner market, whereby the comune paid a sizable bounty for each captive enemy. If the comune deemed the cost too high, it left the prisoner in the captor's hands free to sell or ransom him. Such a system was hardly charitable, yet it effectively spurred the soldiers to give their utmost in battle. Alongside the berrovieri, the Florentine council also hired specialized captains. One Pietro di Bazzacapa from Milan was contracted for himself and 50 men, on condition that he not include any Florentine criminals convicted of serious offenses. Their monthly pay stood at 8 florins per head, roughly 35 lire, equivalent to around 19,000 modern dollars, by no means a paltry sum. For crossbowmen and archers, the comune appointed officials to recruit one marksman in every 4 individuals per parish, seeking out young, skilled archers. At the same time, they trained the pavesari, who carried large pavesi shields, behind which crossbowmen could shelter in action. The most symbolic element of the Florentine army was bound up with the carroccio, a war cart painted bright vermilion and fitted with 2 poles supporting the comune's banner, vital for identifying one's headquarters amid the chaos of battle. It was drawn by 2 oxen in colorful harness, protected by dozens of milites and an infantry contingent assigned by a sesto. A proposal was also raised to recruit 200 sappers and 100 marraioli, tasked with leveling the ground and demolishing any enemy fortifications. On the logistical front, Florence required the countryside to supply large amounts of grain and other provisions. Moreover, to safeguard the city while its main army was away, a detailed defensive network was established, designed to stem away any potential Sienese raids. Plans were made for a system of fire or smoke-based signals to alert the authorities to an approaching foe. By night, the number of bonfires and the rate at which they were lit and extinguished indicated the size of the threat. By day, plumes of smoke served the same role. As summer drew near, the size of Florence's army became truly imposing. A figure of 35,000 soldiers circulated, said to be ready to depart for Montalcino, believing that they would either undertake a protracted siege or a pitched battle against Siena's forces, themselves bolstered by the knights sent by Manfredi. This illustrates Florence's recognition that it was at a real crossroads. Either halt Siena's expansion from the outset, or risk Montepulciano and Montalcino falling irrevocably into rival sphere, undermining the entire balance of Tuscany. In the meantime, Siena did not stand idle. Its counteroffensive, calls for reinforcements, and the arrival of German knights all signaled that their words were about to give way to deeds on the side as well. We have fewer precise sources for Siena, so we can only hypothesize based on parallels with other 13th century troops masters. Given the severity of the looming Florentine attack, there was no room in Siena for partial or rotational recruitment. The Comune summoned all milites and cavalcatores, meaning the fully armed nobility young men not yet invested with the kingolus, and even commoners who could fight on horseback. Essentially, any man between the ages of 16 and 70. Siena's army did not match Florence in numbers. Sources from the spring mention some 600 citizens' cavalry with additional horsemen from the countryside, German and Italian mercenaries, as well as a certain number of Florentine exiles. Though these are hard to quantify. There were also a sizable body of men sent by Manfredi. According to the chronicles, a first contingent of 600 knights led by Count Giordano d'Agliano, the same Count Giordano d'Agliano cited in the merchant letter, arrived in Siena at the end of 1259, with a second group of 800 knights coming a few months later. These figures, however, lack administrative records to confirm them and stem solely from accounts of varying reliability. It is likely the true benefit of such outside allies was less than later Florentine sources would claim. For their part, the Sienese infantry was organized, like the cavalry, according to their terzi, their neighborhoods, then split into formations of 50 men, the so-called cinquantine. Unlike what would be said in later periods, there was as yet no military company system in Siena around 1260. In the era of Montaperti, one heard instead of Società delle Armi, formations that might well include professional soldiers from diverse backgrounds. We do not know precisely what role they played in Siena's frantic preparation that summer, but in any event, the city called on all its resources, fearing Florence might raze it to the ground with the power of its large army. It's even more difficult to gauge possible reinforcements from Sienese territories or allied cities. In the communal wars, it was standard practice to leave garrisons in border strongholds rather than gather every soldier into a single field force. Thus, at least some men from the most vulnerable fortresses, particularly in Chianti or the Maremma, remained at their posts, shielding against Florentine incursions. Similarly, contingents dispatched from nominally allied locations like Cortona were never definitively counted. Later chronicles also passed down the legend of Saracen archers from Lucera and schismatic Greeks coming to Siena's aid, a topic appearing in Guelph propaganda and in some narratives composed decades or even centuries later. These rumors stemmed from the fact that Manfred of Sicily, in no other circumstances, for instance during the 1264 campaign around Rome, did indeed fled some Muslim archers. Yet there is no confirmation of their presence at Montaperti in any administrative or near-contemporary accounts of the battle. The sole reference to a force made up of non modica Sarracenorum, Graecorum, Germanorum, et Regnicularum militum appears in a letter the Florentine Guelphs addressed to Emperor Conradin, aiming to secure his intervention. It may have been a rhetorical exaggeration designed to paint the invasion as an almost infidel, unholy menace. Although there are no records akin to Florence, we know that Siena deployed its own carroccio, a war cart bearing a great white banner, a symbol of enormous moral weight, no different to the Florentine version, and destined to figure in epic accounts of the looming battle. As for commanders in the field, later historians relished embellishing stories of supposed general captains or feudal noblemen acting as strategists. Yet the most likely candidate for coordinating Sienese forces was Francesco Troisio, the city's podestà and a trusted associate of King Manfred of Sicily. Giordano d'Agliano, for his part, oversaw a broader strategy, wielding the authority bestowed by the Swabian monarch. Thus, two massive forces emerged, both seeking a decisive showdown. On one side, Siena, convinced it could subdue Montalcino and Montepulciano with Manfred's backing. On the other, Florence, which, despite internal divisions and potential inconsistency of its allies, had formed a cohesive bloc, ready to prevail. During these months, the Florentines believed they had a genuine chance of success, in spite of conflicting signals coming from the field. And so, with these forces, these recruitment contracts, and the constant clang of weaponry being readied, the army finally set out towards late summer, crossing the boundaries of Florence territory and marching resolutely into the Val d'Orcia. The decisive encounter was now only a short way off, and the steer of these preparations would soon give way to action. The confrontation that went down in history as the Battle of Montaperti. But that is a story for our next episode. Thank you for listening, and until next time.